Tonight, we journey back over 4,000 years to explore one of the most beautiful and mysterious belief systems ever created by human civilization. We will walk along the banks of the Nile, gaze up at the same stars the ancient Egyptians watched, and discover how they understood the birth of everything. This is the story of Egyptian cosmology, where gods danced across the sky, where the universe emerged from endless waters, and where every sunrise was a miracle worth celebrating. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of Egyptian history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Have you ever tried to imagine nothing? Not darkness, because darkness is something. Not silence, because silence is the absence of sound, which means sound exists. True nothingness is almost impossible for our minds to grasp. But this is exactly where the ancient Egyptians began their story of creation. They called this state of nothingness none, and understanding none is the key to understanding everything else about how the Egyptians viewed the universe. Picture this if you can. There was no ground beneath your feet, because there were no feet and no ground. There was no sky above, because there was no above or below. There were no stars, because there was no space for them to exist in. There was only water, but not water as we know it. This was not the blue water of the Nile or the Mediterranean Sea. The waters of none were different. They were dark, heavy, motionless, and infinite. They stretched in every direction forever, though direction itself did not truly exist yet. The ancient Egyptians were not just making up a story when they talked about none. Think about what they saw every single year. The Nile River would flood, covering the land with water. When the waters finally went away, the land would emerge again, rich and fertile, and ready to grow crops. Life came from water receding. Creation came from water pulling back. So it made perfect sense to them that the entire universe must have started the same way, emerging from an infinite ocean. But here is the really interesting part. The Egyptians did not think of none as something that existed only at the beginning of time. They believed none was still out there, surrounding the entire world, pressing in at the edges of everything. None was patient, none was eternal, and if the gods ever stopped doing their jobs, if Ma'at, which was the Egyptian concept of order and balance, ever failed, then none would come rushing back in. Everything would return to those dark, motionless waters. Creation was not a one-time event that happened long ago. It was something that had to be maintained, protected, and renewed every single day. The scribes of ancient Egypt wrote about none in ways that send shivers down your spine even today. They described it as the inert one, meaning it did not move or change. It simply existed, waiting with the patience of eternity itself. Within none, there was no life, but there was potential for life. There was no light, but there was potential for light. Everything that would ever exist was somehow already there in none, sleeping, waiting for the moment of awakening. Now here is a question that might help you drift off to sleep tonight. If none was everywhere and everything, if there was nothing but these primordial waters, then where did the first god come from? How can something emerge from nothing? The ancient Egyptians had different answers to this question depending on which city you visited and which priests you asked. But all their answers shared something beautiful. They all agreed that somehow, impossibly, wonderfully, the first god created himself. The most popular version of this story came from a city called Heliopolis, which means City of the Sun in Greek, though the Egyptians called it Iunu. The priests of Heliopolis said that within the waters of none, a thought occurred. Consciousness sparked into existence, and that first thought, that first moment of self-awareness, was the god Atum. His name literally means the complete one, because he contained within himself everything that was, everything that is, and everything that would ever be. Atum was alone, completely, utterly alone, in a way that none of us can truly understand. He floated in the waters of none, the only being in all of existence, surrounded by infinite nothingness. Can you imagine that loneliness? But Atum was not content to remain alone. He had within him the creative force of the entire universe. He was the first sunrise, the first breath, the first heartbeat. And so Atum began the work of creation. But before he could create anything else, Atum needed a place to stand. You cannot build a universe while floating in infinite water. You need solid ground. And so, through pure will, through divine power, through the force of thought itself, Atum caused a mound of earth to rise up from the waters of none. This mound, called the Benben, was the first solid matter in all of existence. It was the first piece of the universe that was not water. It was the beginning of everything. The Benben stone was sacred to the ancient Egyptians. They believed that in the great temple of Ra at Heliopolis, there was an actual stone that was the original Benben, the very same mound that Atum stood upon at the moment of creation. Pilgrims would travel for hundreds of miles just to see this stone and touch it. When the pharaohs built their pyramids, they were imitating the shape of the Benben. The capstone at the very top of each pyramid, called the pyramidion, was meant to represent that first mound of creation. Even obelisks, those tall, pointed monuments that the Egyptians built, were based on the shape of the Benben. Think about what this meant to the Egyptians. Every time they looked at a pyramid, they were looking at a model of creation itself. Every time they saw an obelisk, they were seeing a representation of the moment when solid matter first appeared in the universe. Their greatest architectural achievements were not just monuments to dead kings. They were prayers in stone. They were ways of participating in the ongoing act of creation, of pushing back against none, of maintaining order against chaos. Standing alone on the Benben, Atum looked around at the vast emptiness and knew that he had to continue the work of creation. But there was a problem. He was the only being in existence. There was no one else to help him create, no partner to join him in the work. And so Atum did something that might seem strange to us, but made perfect sense in Egyptian thinking. He created two new gods from his own body. Different versions of the story tell this in different ways. Some say he sneezed them out. Some say he spat them forth. Others say he brought them into being through an act that we might find even more surprising, but which the Egyptians did not consider shameful at all. However it happened, from Atum came two new deities. The first was Shu, whose name means he who rises up. Shu was the god of air, of breath, of the empty space that allows things to exist separately from each other. The second was Tefnut, whose name means she of moisture. Tefnut was the goddess of moisture, of wetness, of the humidity that hangs in the air. Together, Shu and Tefnut represented the first separation within creation. Before them, everything was undifferentiated, united, one. With them came the first duality, air and moisture, male and female, the beginning of distinction and difference. The moment Shu and Tefnut came into being was a turning point in cosmic history. For the first time, Atum was not alone. For the first time, there was conversation, relationship, interaction. The universe had gone from 1 to 3, and this was just the beginning. Creation was unfolding like a flower opening its petals to greet the dawn. Chapter 2. The first family of gods. So now there were 3 gods where before there had been only nothingness. Atum stood on the Benben, and with him were his 2 children, Shu and Tefnut. But the story was just beginning. The Egyptians understood something profound about creation. It was not a single act, but an ongoing process. Each generation would build upon the work of the previous one. Creation was like a story unfolding, or a flower slowly opening its petals to the sun, Shu and Tefnut grew and explored the strange new reality they found themselves in. They wandered in the darkness, for there was still no sun to provide light. They investigated the borders between the Benben and the surrounding waters of Nun. And as time passed, something happened that changed everything. Shu and Tefnut fell in love. Now, you might think it strange that brother and sister would become husband and wife, but the ancient Egyptians did not view this as we do. In the realm of the gods, different rules applied. The divine family had to populate the universe, and there were not exactly a lot of options at the dawn of time. What mattered to the Egyptians was not our modern sensibilities about relationships, but the symbolic meaning of the union. Shu represented air and space. Tefnut represented moisture. When air and moisture combine, what happens? Clouds form, rain falls, life becomes possible. From the union of Shu and Tefnut came two more gods, and these two would become absolutely central to the Egyptian understanding of the universe. Their names were Geb and Nut. Geb was male, and he would become the god of the earth itself. Every hill, every valley, every grain of sand was part of Geb's body. When earthquakes shook the land, the Egyptians said that Geb was laughing. When green plants sprouted from the soil, they were growing from Geb's skin. He was the ground beneath your feet, the solid foundation of all life. Nut was female, and she would become the goddess of the sky. But the Egyptian sky was not like our abstract concept of empty space dotted with stars. No, Nut was a literal goddess, a woman whose body stretched across the entire heavens. Her fingertips touched the eastern horizon. Her toes touched the western horizon. She arched over the world, her body spangled with stars. When you looked up at night, you were looking at the body of the goddess Nut, and those stars were jewels or ornaments decorating her skin. The ancient Egyptians often painted Nut on the ceilings of tombs and temples. They showed her as a beautiful woman, her body covered in stars, arching protectively over the space below. Imagine being an ancient Egyptian, lying on your back, looking up at the night sky. You would not see distant balls of gas burning millions of miles away. You would see a goddess, a protective mother figure, watching over you. The entire sky was alive, divine, and personal. But here is where the story becomes even more interesting. Geb and Nut were not just brother and sister like their parents. They were twins, born at the same moment, two halves of a whole. And from the instant they came into being, they loved each other with a passion that would shape the entire structure of the universe. They were not content to merely be close to each other. They wrapped themselves in a tight embrace. Geb and Nut held each other so closely that there was no space between them at all. The earth and the sky were one, pressed together, leaving no room for anything else to exist. Can you picture it? The earth god and the sky goddess locked in an eternal embrace, their bodies pressed together so tightly that nothing could fit between them. It was beautiful in its way, this perfect union of earth and sky, but it was also a problem. If Geb and Nut remained joined together, there would be no space for life to exist, no room for plants to grow, for animals to walk, for humans to build their cities. Creation had come to a standstill. This is when Shu, the god of air and space, stepped in. He received a command from his grandfather Atum. The earth and sky had to be separated. There had to be space between them, room for creation to continue. And so Shu approached his children, Geb and Nut, as they lay in their tight embrace. What happened next became one of the most important images in all of Egyptian religion. Shu pushed himself between Geb and Nut. He placed his feet firmly on Geb's body, the earth, and he raised his arms high, lifting Nut up and up and up. The lovers cried out as they were forced apart. Geb reached upward desperately, his arms stretching toward Nut, trying to hold on to her. His fingers became hills and mountains, reaching up toward the sky. She stretched downward, trying to remain close to him, her hair becoming the rain that falls to earth, her tears becoming the dew that forms on grass in the morning. But Shu was strong. Shu was determined. He lifted Nut higher and higher until she formed a perfect arch across the sky, her body stretching from one horizon to the other. Geb lay flat below the earth, forever gazing upward at his beloved whom he could see but no longer touch. The ancient Egyptians painted this scene over and over again. You can find it in tombs, on papyrus scrolls, carved into temple walls. Geb lies at the bottom, often coloured green or black like fertile soil, sometimes with plants growing from his body. Nut arches above, coloured blue and covered with yellow stars that shine like gold. And between them stands Shu, his arms raised, his muscles straining, forever holding up the sky, creating and maintaining the space in which all life exists. Every time you take a breath, you are breathing Shu. Every time you look at the space between the ground and the sky, you are seeing Shu's work. He is the atmosphere itself, the air that fills your lungs, the invisible force that keeps the world in proper order. But the story does not end with this separation. Even though they were now apart, Geb and Nut still loved each other desperately. They could see each other but never touch. It was a tragedy that played out across the entire cosmos. And yet, from their brief time together before the separation, Nut had become pregnant. She was carrying not one child, but 5. These 5 children would become some of the most important gods in the entire Egyptian system of beliefs, gods whose stories would be told for thousands of years, whose temples would be the largest and most magnificent in all of Egypt. However, there was a problem. Ra, who was another form of Atum, or perhaps Atum transformed into his solar aspect, had become the king of the gods by this point. The cycle of creation was continuing, and the supreme deity was evolving and changing. When Ra learned that Nut was pregnant, he grew worried. He feared that one of Nut's children might grow up to challenge his rule, might become powerful enough to overthrow him and take his place as king of the gods. This was not paranoia. In many mythologies, including the Greek stories that came later, the younger generation of gods did indeed overthrow their elders. Ra wanted to prevent this, and so Ra pronounced a curse, using all his power as the sun god and king of the divine realm. He declared that Nut would not be able to give birth on any day of any month of any year. Since the Egyptian year had 360 days divided into 12 months of 30 days each, this seemed to doom Nut to be eternally pregnant, never able to deliver her children. She would carry them forever, swollen with unborn gods, unable to release them into the world. Nut was desperate and heartbroken. She was separated from the husband she loved. She was pregnant with 5 children who were growing inside her and could not be born, and she was powerless against Ra's curse. In her desperation, she turned to Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, magic, and cunning. Thoth was known throughout the divine realm as the cleverest of all the gods. If anyone could find a loophole in Ra's curse, it would be Thoth. Thoth listened to Nut's problem and began to think. Ra had said she could not give birth on any day of the year. But what if there were days that existed outside the year? Days that were not part of the official calendar? This was the key. Thoth came up with a plan that was so clever, so brilliant, that it would not only solve Nut's problem, but would also permanently change the structure of the Egyptian calendar. Thoth went to Khonsu, the moon god, whose silver light illuminated the night sky. Thoth challenged Khonsu to a game. They would play Senet, a board game that was extremely popular throughout Egypt. People of all social classes played Senet, from farmers to pharaohs. It was a game of both strategy and luck, where pieces moved across a board according to the throw of sticks or dice. But when Thoth and Khonsu played, the stakes were not ordinary. They would gamble, and the wager would be portions of moonlight itself. Thoth was very good at Senet. Perhaps he used his wisdom to calculate probabilities. Perhaps he used a bit of subtle magic to influence the dice. Perhaps he was just lucky. But whatever the reason, Thoth won again and again. Each time he won, he claimed a small portion of Khonsu's light. The moon grew dimmer and dimmer as Thoth won more and more of its radiance. By the time they finished playing, Thoth had won enough moonlight to create 5 entirely new days. These days did not belong to any month. They were not part of the official 360-day year. They existed outside of time, in a sense. They were extra, additional, magical. The Egyptians called these the epigomenal days, meaning days upon the year, or additional days. Because these days were not technically part of the year, they were not covered by Ra's curse. On these days, Nut was able to give birth. The 5 epigomenal days were considered special, even dangerous. Because they existed outside the normal flow of time, they were thought to be unstable, liminal, magical. The barriers between the world of humans and the world of gods were thinner during these days. Strange things might happen. Magic was stronger. The Egyptians approached these 5 days with both celebration and caution. On the first epigomenal day, Nut brought forth Osiris. He emerged into the world as the stars were singing, and a voice rang out across the cosmos announcing that the Lord of all had been born. Osiris would become one of the most important gods in the Egyptian system, the god of death and resurrection, the king of the afterlife, the judge of souls. He represented the cycles of nature, the grain that is cut down and buried but then sprouts again, the promise that death is not an ending but a transformation. On the second epigomenal day, Nut gave birth to Horus the Elder, also called Heroeris. This was not the same as Horus the Younger, son of Osiris and Isis, whose story would come later. Horus the Elder was a sky god in his own right, a falcon-headed deity whose eyes were the sun and moon, whose wings stretched across the heavens. He was often associated with the pharaohs, and every king of Egypt would take the name Horus as part of his royal titles, identifying himself with this powerful god. On the third epigomenal day came Set, also called Seth. Set would become one of the most complex and controversial gods in the Egyptian system. He was the god of chaos, storms, the desert, and foreigners. He was associated with the colour red, with violence, with everything that was outside the ordered world of Egyptian civilization. Set was not evil in the way we might think of it. He was necessary. Chaos has its place in the universe. The desert surrounds the fertile Nile Valley, but it also protects Egypt from invaders. Storms are destructive, but they also clear the air and bring change. Set was dangerous, unpredictable, and absolutely essential to the balance of the cosmos. On the fourth epigomenal day, Isis was born. She would become perhaps the most beloved of all Egyptian goddesses. Isis was associated with magic, with motherhood, with healing, with protection. She was depicted as a woman with a throne-shaped crown on her head, or sometimes with the horns and sun disk of a cow goddess. Isis was clever, resourceful, and deeply loving. Her myths would spread far beyond Egypt. In the later periods of Egyptian history and into the Roman era, the worship of Isis would spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Temples to Isis would be built in Greece, in Rome, in Asia Minor. She became an international goddess, loved by people of many different cultures. On the fifth and final epigomenal day, Nephthys was born. Her name means Lady of the House, or Lady of the Temple Enclosure. Nephthys was associated with morning, night, the invisible, the margins and edges of things. She was often depicted alongside her sister Isis. the two of them acting as protectors and mourners. While Isis represented the bright, visible, life-giving aspects of femininity and divinity, Nephthys represented the shadow aspects, the hidden, the mysterious. Both were necessary, both were honoured. These 5 gods, the children of Geb and Nut, completed what the Egyptians called the Ennead, which means the 9. These were the 9 great gods of creation, according to the Heliopolitan tradition. Counting them out, we have Atum at the beginning, who created Shu and Tefnut, who gave birth to Geb and Nut, who produced Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. That is 9 gods across 3 generations. This was the divine family that created the universe and everything in it. They were the foundation upon which all of Egyptian religion was built. Chapter 3. The City of 8 and the Cosmic Egg. But the story from Heliopolis was not the only creation story that the ancient Egyptians told. Egypt was a vast country, stretching along the Nile for hundreds of miles, from the Mediterranean coast in the north all the way south into Nubia. Different cities had different temples, different priests, and different traditions. Religion in Egypt was not centrally organized the way we might think of modern religions. There was no single sacred text that everyone agreed on, no pope or central authority who decided what was orthodox and what was heresy. Instead, each major city had its own primary deity, its own temples, and its own sacred stories. These different traditions coexisted, sometimes competed, but mostly just existed side by side, each offering a different perspective on the great mysteries of existence. While Heliopolis taught about Atum and the Ennead, another city had its own version of how the universe began. This city was called Kmun by the Egyptians, which means 8 town in their language. The Greeks would later call it Hermopolis, meaning the city of Hermes, because they identified the Egyptian god Thoth with their own god Hermes. Both were gods of writing, wisdom, and magic, so the association made sense. And the creation story from Hermopolis was beautifully different from the Heliopolitan version, approaching the mystery of existence from another angle. Instead of beginning with one god creating himself from nothing, the Hermopolitan tradition spoke of 8 gods who existed together in the waters of none before creation. These 8 gods were called the Ogdoad, which simply means the group of 8 in Greek. But these were not 8 different individuals with different personalities and different roles, the way you might think of 8 separate beings. Instead, they were 4 pairs of opposites, 4 married couples who represented the fundamental qualities of the universe before anything existed. They were less like people and more like abstract principles that had somehow become conscious and divine. The first pair was Nun and Nornet. Nun we already know about, the personification of the primordial waters, the infinite ocean of chaos and potential from which everything would emerge. Nornet was his female counterpart, representing the same watery abyss but from a female principle. Together, they embodied the infinite ocean of nothingness. They were water itself, formless, boundless, containing all possibilities. The second pair was He and Hauhet. Their names mean endlessness or infinity. They represented the boundless nature of existence before creation, the sense that things stretched on forever with no beginning and no end. Before creation, there was no measure, no limit, no boundary. Everything was infinite. He and Hauhet were that infinity made divine, that endlessness personified. They were the quality of eternity itself, time without beginning or end, space without borders or limits. The third pair was Kek and Kauket. Their names mean darkness, and they represented the complete and utter absence of light that existed before the sun was created. But this was not the darkness of night, which is simply the absence of the sun for a while, knowing that dawn will come. No, this was absolute darkness, darkness that had never known light and had no expectation of ever knowing light. It was the darkness of non-existence, the darkness of the void, darkness so complete that the very concept of light did not yet exist to contrast with it. The fourth pair was Amun and Amunet. Their names mean hidden or concealed or that which is unknown. They represented the mysterious, unknowable nature of the primordial state. Even if you could somehow go back to the beginning of everything, even if you could float in the waters of none alongside these 8 gods, you still would not be able to fully understand or comprehend what you were experiencing. Mystery itself was one of the fundamental building blocks of reality. Some things are inherently beyond understanding, and Amun and Amunet embodied that principle. Now, what did these 8 gods look like? The Egyptians depicted them in a very specific and meaningful way. The male gods, Nun, He, Kek, and Amun, were shown with the heads of frogs. The female gods, Nornet, Hauhet, Kauket, and Amunet, were shown with the heads of serpents. Why frogs and serpents? Because these were animals that the Egyptians saw emerging from the mud when the Nile floods receded each year. When the waters pulled back and the fertile black soil was exposed, suddenly there were frogs everywhere, croaking and hopping. Frogs seemed to generate spontaneously from the wet earth, and serpents slithered out from the mud, having been dormant during the flood. These creatures represented the principle of life emerging from the boundary between water and land, between chaos and order, between non-existence and existence. They were perfect symbols for gods who existed at the very beginning of everything, who were present at that critical moment when something first emerged from nothing. The 8 gods of the Ogdoad existed together in the waters of Nun, and they engaged in a great act of creation. According to the Hermopolitan tradition, these 8 primordial deities came together and laid an egg. This was not an ordinary egg, of course. It was the cosmic egg, the egg that contained all of creation, everything that was, is, or ever would be. All of reality was packed into this one miraculous egg. This egg rested on the Island of Flames, which was the Hermopolitan version of the primordial mound, the first solid land to emerge from the waters of chaos. Some versions say the egg rested on a lotus flower that grew from the mound, adding another layer of symbolism. The lotus was sacred in Egyptian culture because it closed at night and sank beneath the water, then rose and opened again with the dawn. It was a perfect symbol of rebirth, renewal, and the daily cycle of death and resurrection. Then, when the time was right, when the cosmic moment arrived, the egg cracked open. What emerged from it? The sun, the very first sunrise. The god Ra, blazing with light and heat, breaking forth from the cosmic egg and driving away the eternal darkness that had existed since forever. Can you imagine that moment? Think about it deeply. For countless ages, for eons beyond counting, there had been only darkness. The 8 gods had existed in complete blackness, never having seen light, never having experienced warmth, never having known anything but the cold, dark, motionless waters of Nun. And then suddenly, brilliantly, impossibly, the egg cracked and the sun burst forth. The first light, the first warmth, the first dawn. Colours appeared for the first time. Shadows were cast for the first time. The concept of illumination, of seeing, of brightness, all of these became real in that single cosmic instant. The darkness fled before Ra's radiance. The waters of Nun were lit up, sparkling for the first time. The primordial mound was illuminated, and its shape and colour could be seen. The 8 gods of the Ogdoad beheld their creation, and it was more wonderful than they had imagined. In some versions of this story, it was not the sun god Ra who hatched from the egg, or rather, not Ra in his usual form. Instead, it was a bird. This bird was called the Bennu bird, which would later be associated with the Greek phoenix. The Bennu bird was deeply connected with the sun, with rebirth, with cyclical renewal, with the concept that death is not an ending but a transformation into new life. The Bennu bird was said to live for thousands of years, accumulating knowledge and power, and then, at the appointed time, it would build a nest of aromatic woods and spices. The bird would sit in the nest and sing a song of such heartbreaking beauty that even the gods would weep. Then the nest would burst into flames, consuming the bird entirely. From the ashes, a new Bennu bird would emerge, young and vigorous, ready to live another cycle. The Benben stone, that sacred primordial mound we talked about earlier, was said to be the perch where the Bennu bird first landed after emerging from the cosmic egg. The stone was named after the bird, or perhaps the bird was named after the stone. Either way, they were intimately connected. The sacred Benben stone in the temple at Heliopolis was believed to be the actual landing spot of the first Bennu bird, the very place where the sun first touched the earth. What is fascinating about the Hermopolitan creation myth is how it deals with the concept of nothingness and the emergence of something from nothing. The Ogdoad did not create the universe from nothing. Instead, they themselves were part of that nothingness. They were qualities of non-existence: water, infinity, darkness, and hiddenness. These are not things that exist in a physical positive sense. They are absences, negations, voids. They are the qualities that define emptiness. Water is the absence of solidity. Infinity is the absence of boundaries. Darkness is the absence of light. Hiddenness is the absence of revelation. And yet, from these 8 abstract principles, from these 8 gods who represented nothingness itself, came the egg that contained everything. From nothing came something. From absence came presence. From void came fullness. It is one of the most profound creation myths ever conceived by human imagination. The Egyptians were not troubled by having multiple creation stories that seemed to contradict each other. In modern times, we often want things to be consistent. We want one coherent story that explains everything. We get uncomfortable with contradictions. But the ancient Egyptians thought differently. In Heliopolis, the priests taught that Atum created himself and stood on the Benben, then brought forth the other gods through his own power. In Hermopolis, the priests taught that 8 gods laid an egg from which the sun was born. In Memphis, yet another city, the priests taught that Ptah, the craftsman god, created everything through the power of thought and speech, that he spoke the world into existence the way a craftsman plans and describes his work before making it. Did this mean one story was true and the others false? Not to the Egyptian way of thinking. All the stories were true. All the stories were ways of approaching the great mystery of existence. It was like looking at a beautiful jewel from different angles. From one side, it sparkles with blue light. From another side, it shines red. From above, it looks completely different than from below. But the jewel itself contains all these colours, all these aspects, all these perspectives. The truth itself contained all stories. The mystery of creation was too vast, too profound, too overwhelming to be captured in a single narrative. It took multiple stories, multiple perspectives, multiple approaches to even begin to understand the miracle of existence. This is something we might learn from the ancient Egyptians. Truth can be approached from many directions. Different perspectives can all be valid. The universe is vast enough to contain multitudes, complex enough to defy simple explanations. The Egyptians were comfortable holding multiple ideas in their minds at once, letting different stories illuminate different facets of the same underlying reality. Chapter 4. The Radiant Journey of the Sun. Now that the sun existed, now that Ra had burst forth from the cosmic egg, or emerged as an aspect of Atum, the universe had light and warmth for the first time in its history. But the sun did not simply hang motionless in the sky like a lamp. Every day, the ancient Egyptians watched the sun rise in the east, travel across the sky, reaching its highest point at noon, then descending and setting in the west. Every night, they experienced darkness, waiting through long hours until the dawn came again. And every morning, miraculously, wonderfully, reassuringly, the sun rose again. It returned. It was reborn. For the Egyptians, this daily cycle was not an automatic process, not a simple mechanical phenomenon that happened on its own. It was a journey, an adventure, even a battle. It was Ra's sacred duty, his daily work, his eternal burden, and it was absolutely essential to the continued existence of the universe. If Ra ever failed to complete his journey, if the sun ever failed to rise, that would be the end of everything. Creation would collapse, none would rush back in, the universe would return to the dark, motionless waters of chaos. The Egyptians believed that Ra travelled across the sky in a boat. This might seem strange at first. A boat in the sky? How does that work? But remember who the Egyptians were and where they lived. They were people of the Nile. The river was the absolute centre of their civilization. It was their highway, their source of water, their provider of food, their connection between different parts of the kingdom. Everyone travelled by boat. Goods were transported up and down the Nile by boat. The pharaoh had royal boats for travelling between his palaces. The gods had sacred boats that were carried in religious processions. It made perfect sense to the Egyptians that Ra would use a boat to cross the sky, just as any traveller would use a boat to journey along the Nile. The sky was simply the celestial river, the overhead Nile, the divine waterway along which the sun gods sailed. This boat was called the solar barque, or sometimes the manjet, which means the boat of millions of years. It was magnificent beyond description, a vessel worthy of the sun god himself. It was made of gold that never tarnished, decorated with precious jewels that sparkled in Ra's light, shining almost as brightly as the sun itself. The boat was enormous, large enough to carry many divine passengers, yet it moved through the sky with the grace of a swan gliding across still water, and Ra did not travel alone on his daily journey. This is important. Many other gods accompanied him on the solar barque, each with specific roles to play, each contributing to the successful completion of the journey. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, was there to record everything that happened, to keep the divine logbook, to document each day's journey. Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order, often accompanied Ra to maintain the balance of the universe, to ensure that everything proceeded according to the proper order. Horus, the falcon-headed god, stood at the prow of the boat as a guardian, his sharp eyes watching for any threats, his strength ready to defend the sun. And in some versions of the story, the pharaoh himself, after death, if he had lived righteously and been judged favourably, would earn a place on Ra's solar bark. This was one of the highest honours imaginable. To sail with the sun god forever, participating in the daily renewal of creation, this was a glorious afterlife reserved for the most righteous kings. Every morning, as dawn approached, Ra's boat would appear at the eastern horizon. The sky would begin to lighten, birds would start their morning songs. The Egyptians would wake, and if they were devout, they would go outside or look through their windows to watch the sunrise. As the boat rose higher, Ra brought light and warmth to the world below. Farmers could see to work their fields, fishermen could navigate the Nile, craftsmen could see to do their delicate work, children could play. All of life depended on Ra's light. Plants could grow, converting sunlight into the energy that would feed humans and animals. Everything depended on Ra completing his journey successfully. The boat sailed across the Sky River, moving from east to west, following the same path day after day after day, for thousands and thousands of years. At noon, when the sun reached its highest point, Ra was at the peak of his power. The heat was strongest, shadows were shortest. This was the moment of maximum light and warmth. Temples would hold midday rituals, offering prayers and incense to Ra at the height of his power. As the afternoon progressed, Ra began his descent toward the western horizon. The sun got lower in the sky, shadows grew longer, the temperature cooled. The light changed, becoming golden and warm instead of the harsh white of midday. And as sunset approached, the sky would blaze with colours: orange, red, purple, pink. The Egyptians saw this as Ra's radiance, mixing with the colours of the approaching night, a beautiful transition between day and darkness. But what happened at sunset? Where did the boat go when it disappeared below the western horizon? This is where the story becomes even more interesting and takes on darker, more dramatic tones. The Egyptians believed that when the sun set in the west, Ra entered the Duat. The Duat was the realm of the dead, the underworld, but it was not simply below the earth like a basement or cave system. It was more complex than that. The Duat was a parallel dimension, a strange mirror world that existed alongside normal reality. It was a place where different rules applied, where time moved differently, where the impossible became possible and the normal became strange. When Ra entered the Duat at sunset, his boat transformed. It was no longer the bright, glorious manjet with its gold and jewels gleaming in the sunlight. It became the Mesektet, the night barque. This was a darker, more serious vessel. And instead of sailing easily across a clear sky river with his divine companions singing hymns of praise, Ra now had to navigate through darkness, through dangers, through a landscape filled with demons, monsters, and obstacles that sought to prevent him from completing his journey and reaching the eastern horizon for rebirth at dawn. The Duat was divided into 12 regions, one for each hour of the night. Each region had its own unique characteristics, its own guardians, its own challenges that Ra had to overcome. The Egyptians developed detailed maps of these regions, which they painted on tomb walls and wrote in papyrus texts. These maps were not just religious art, they were practical guides. If a deceased person knew the geography of the Duat, if they could identify the different regions and knew the names of the guardians and demons they would encounter, they would have a much better chance of successfully navigating the afterlife themselves. In the first hour of the night, Ra entered the Duat through the western gate. The souls of the dead would gather along the shore of the Underworld river, crying out to him, begging for his attention, hoping that his light might illuminate their own journeys through the afterlife. Ra's light brought brief comfort to these souls, a momentary respite from the darkness and fear of the underworld. In the second and third hours, Ra sailed through increasingly strange and dangerous waters. The landscape became bizarre. Strange gods and goddesses appeared, some helpful, some threatening. There were rivers of fire that had to be crossed. There were gates guarded by demons who would only allow passage if the correct passwords and spells were spoken. The boat moved more slowly now. The waters were difficult to navigate. It was getting harder for Ra to make progress. In the fourth and fifth hours, Ra descended deeper into the Duat, moving further from the world of the living, approaching the very bottom of the underworld. The waters became thick and sluggish. The darkness became more oppressive. This was the long middle of the night, when dawn seems impossibly far away, when the world is coldest and darkest, when hope becomes difficult to maintain. The sixth hour was the deepest point, the very middle of the night, the bottom of Ra's journey. This was when Ra reached the most dangerous part of his entire journey through the Duat. This was the hour of maximum peril, when everything could go wrong, when creation itself hung in the balance. In most versions of the story, the sixth hour of the night was when Ra encountered the great serpent demon Apophis, also called Apep. Apophis was not just another demon or monster. Apophis was chaos incarnate, the enemy of all order, the force that wanted to return the universe to the primordial nothingness of none. Apophis was enormous beyond imagination, a serpent so vast that when he coiled his body, he could surround mountains. His mouth could swallow the sun. His hatred of existence was absolute and eternal. Apophis was not interested in ruling the universe or becoming king of the gods. He did not want power or worship. He simply wanted everything to stop existing. He wanted the universe to return to the perfect, peaceful, dark stillness of none. He wanted to undo creation itself. Every night, every single night without exception, Apophis tried to swallow Ra's boat. If Apophis succeeded, the sun would not rise the next morning. Plants would die. Animals would freeze. Humans would perish. Creation would end. The entire universe would be destroyed, returning to the dark waters of chaos from which it had emerged. But Ra had protectors, defenders who stood ready to fight off Apophis every night. The most surprising of these defenders was Set, the god of chaos and storms, the god associated with violence and the desert, the god who was himself dangerous and unpredictable. But Set was an enemy of Apophis. They were old rivals. Set represented the chaos that existed within creation, the disorder that was part of the natural world. Apophis represented the absolute chaos that existed before creation, the chaos that wanted to destroy everything. Set understood that his own existence depended on creation continuing. If Apophis destroyed the universe, Set would be destroyed too. So every night, Set stood at the prow of Ra's boat with a spear, ready to fight. The battle between Set and Apophis was fierce, cosmic, reality-shaking. The underworld trembled as these two powerful beings clashed. Set thrust his spear again and again into Apophis's body. Apophis coiled around the boat, trying to crush it, trying to swallow it whole. The other gods on the boat added their power, reciting spells, using magic, striking at the serpent with weapons and words of power. The Egyptians believed that when you heard thunder during the night, it was the sound of Set fighting Apophis in the underworld. When lightning flashed, it was the light from Ra's boat bursting through as the serpent tried to swallow it, or it was the flash of Set's spear striking true. Set was strong and fierce, but even he sometimes needed help. Other gods would join the fight. The souls of righteous humans who had earned a place on Ra's boat would help defend it, taking up weapons and spells, adding their strength to the battle. This was part of the cosmic order. Even humans had a role to play in maintaining creation, in pushing back against the forces of chaos. The battle always followed the same pattern, yet the outcome was never guaranteed. Nothing was automatic. Nothing was certain. Every night was a genuine struggle for the survival of the universe. Apophis never learned, never gave up, never surrendered. He would attack again the next night, and the night after that, forever. And every night, Set and the other defenders had to fight him off again. The sunrise was not a given. It was not guaranteed. It had to be earned, fought for, won through struggle and sacrifice. After the 6th hour, if Ra survived the attack of Apophis, if Set and the other gods managed to drive the serpent back once again, the journey continued. The boat began to rise, moving up through the remaining regions of the Duat, approaching the eastern horizon, where dawn awaited. The 7th, 8th, and 9th hours saw the challenges gradually decrease. The worst was past. Hope began to return. The boat moved faster, the waters became clearer, the path became easier to navigate. In the 10th and 11th hours, Ra was preparing for rebirth. He was transforming, changing from a tomb, the old tired son of evening, into Khepri, the young vigorous son of morning. Khepri was depicted as a scarab beetle, and this choice of symbol was deliberate and meaningful. The Egyptians noticed that scarab beetles rolled balls of dung across the ground, then laid their eggs inside these balls. Later, young beetles would emerge from the balls, seeming to be born from nothing. The scarabs appeared to create life from dead matter. This made them perfect symbols of transformation, rebirth, and the daily renewal of the sun. As Ra passed through the final hours of night, he was becoming Khepri, rolling the sun like a sacred ball of light toward the eastern horizon. The 12th hour was the moment of rebirth itself. Ra reached the eastern horizon, still technically in the Duat, but approaching the exit, preparing to emerge once again into the world of the living. And here, something beautiful and profound happened. The sky goddess Nut, whose body arched across the heavens, would swallow Ra. He would enter her mouth in the west as Atum, the setting sun, and travel through her body during the night. Her body was the Duat, or contained the Duat, or was a pathway through it. The myths are not entirely clear on this point, and perhaps they are deliberately ambiguous. What matters is that Nut would give birth to Ra at dawn in the east. Every sunrise was literally the sun being born from the body of the sky goddess. Every day was a new life for Ra. Every dawn was a birth, a beginning, a fresh start. This is why the Egyptians celebrated sunrise with such joy and reverence, with such relief and gratitude. It was not simply the start of a new day in a mundane sense. It was the triumph of order over chaos. It was proof that the gods were still doing their jobs, still maintaining creation, still fighting off the forces of destruction. It was confirmation that the universe would continue for at least one more day. Nothing could be taken for granted. Every sunrise was a gift. Priests would stand in the temples as dawn approached and sing hymns to greet Ra as he appeared over the horizon. These were beautiful hymns, full of praise and joy. Hail to you, Ra, at your rising. You illuminate the lands with your beauty. You are the living God, existing from the beginning. When you rise on the eastern horizon, you fill every land with your perfection. You are beautiful, great, radiant, high over every land. Your rays embrace the lands to the limits of all you have made. Common people would also pause in their morning routines to acknowledge the miracle of the dawn. A farmer might stop on his way to the fields to face east and murmur a prayer. A mother might take her children outside to watch the sun rise and teach them to give thanks. A merchant might offer a quick prayer before opening his shop. The sunrise was not just background scenery. It was a sacred event, a cosmic victory, a reason for celebration and gratitude. And this cycle would repeat every single day, without fail, for thousands and thousands of years. Ra's journey was eternal. The battle with Apophis would never end. The sunrise would always have to be fought for, earned, protected. This was the burden and the duty of the gods, to maintain creation against the forces that would destroy it. And in a smaller way, it was also the burden and duty of humans. Every time an Egyptian lived according to Ma'at, every time they chose order over chaos, truth over lies, kindness over cruelty, they were helping in the cosmic struggle. They were adding their small strength to the gods' great work. They were participating in creation itself. Chapter 5, Where the Living Meet the Dead. But the ancient Egyptians did not just think about the origins of the universe or the daily journey of the sun. They also thought deeply, constantly, obsessively about what happened to people after they died. In fact, the Egyptians were more focused on death and the afterlife than perhaps any other civilization in history. This was not because they were morbid or depressed or obsessed with dying. Quite the opposite. They loved life. They celebrated life. They filled their tombs with paintings of feasts and parties, hunting and fishing, music and dancing. They wanted life to continue forever, and they believed it could. Death, to the ancient Egyptians, was not the end. Death was a doorway, a transition, a transformation from one form of existence to another. It was a journey to a different place, a different state of being. But this journey was not simple, and it was certainly not guaranteed to succeed. The path to the afterlife was long, difficult, and filled with dangers that could destroy your soul forever. Many people would fail along the way. Only those who had lived good lives, who had followed Ma'at, who had prepared properly and been righteous, would make it to the eternal paradise that waited at the end. When a person died in ancient Egypt, especially if they were wealthy enough to afford the proper rituals and preparations, an elaborate process would begin. This process would take 70 days from death to burial, and every step was crucial. The first and perhaps most important challenge was preservation of the physical body. Why was this so important? The Egyptians believed that each person consisted of several different parts, not just a simple body and soul. This was a sophisticated understanding of human nature, more complex than our modern division between physical and spiritual. There was the cart, the physical body itself, the flesh and bones. There was the car, which was like a life force or spiritual double, an invisible twin that was born with you and stayed with you throughout life. There was the bar, which was like personality or soul, the essence of what made you uniquely you. The bar was often depicted as a bird with a human head, able to fly between the world of the living and the world of the dead. There was the ib, the heart, which the Egyptians considered to be the seat of emotion, thought, and memory, not just a blood pump. There was the ren, your name, which was considered part of your identity, which is why erasing someone's name from monuments was a way of destroying them. There was the shoot, your shadow, and there were other components as well, each with its own name and function. For a person to continue existing in the afterlife, all these different parts needed to stay connected to each other somehow. They needed an anchor point, a home base, a place to return to. The physical body served this purpose. If the body decayed and disappeared, the car and bar would have no anchor point. They would drift away like boats without mooring ropes. They would eventually dissipate, cease to exist. The person would die a second death, the true death, complete destruction. This was the worst fate imaginable. This is why the Egyptians developed the practice of mummification. By preserving the body, they were creating a safe harbour for all the other spiritual components of the person. The body would remain intact, recognizable, permanent. The car and bar could return to it, rest in it, recognize it as their home. Even if the person's soul was travelling through the duat or enjoying the paradise of the field of reeds, they could always come back to their body if needed. The process of mummification was elaborate, expensive, and took great skill. Not everyone could afford it. The very poor might be buried in simple graves, their bodies preserved only by the hot, dry sand of the desert, which naturally dried out corpses and prevented decay. But for those who could afford it, proper mummification was essential. It took 70 days to complete the full process, and every step was performed by priests who specialized in this sacred work. First, the body would be brought to the embalmer's workshop. It would be washed in wine and water from the Nile. Prayers would be recited. The priests would wear masks representing Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and protector of the dead. The first major step was removal of the internal organs, which would decay quickly and had to be taken out. A small incision would be made on the left side of the body, near the stomach. Through this cut, the embalmers would carefully remove the stomach, intestines, liver, and lungs. These organs were important. They could not just be thrown away. Each one would be separately treated, dried, wrapped, and placed in special containers called canopic jars. There were 4 canopic jars for each mummified body, and each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. These were minor deities whose job was to guard the organs. Imsati, who had a human head, guarded the liver. Hapi, who had the head of a baboon, guarded the lungs. Duamutef, who had the head of a jackal, guarded the stomach. Kebes Nuef, who had the head of a falcon, guarded the intestines. These four gods would protect the organs on their journey through the afterlife, just as they protected Ra's solar bark during its nightly journey. But notice what was not removed. The heart, the ib, was left inside the body. This was absolutely crucial. The heart was needed for the judgment in the afterlife. The heart contained a record of everything you had done, every choice you had made, every thought you had thought. The heart was the witness that would testify for or against you in the hall of Ma'at. It had to stay with the body. The brain was a different story. The Egyptians did not think the brain was important at all. They thought thinking happened in the heart, not the brain. So the brain was simply discarded. The embalmers would insert a long hook up through the nose, break through into the skull cavity, and pull out pieces of brain matter. They would then pour in substances to dissolve whatever remained. Eventually, the liquefied brain would drain out through the nose or be flushed out. The brain was just thrown away, considered useless waste. It is somewhat amusing to modern people that the Egyptians so carefully preserved every other organ but discarded the brain without a second thought. Once the organs were removed, the body cavity was washed with wine and spices. Then came the most important step for actual preservation, drying the body completely. Moisture is what allows bacteria to grow and cause decay. Remove all the moisture, and the body will not rot. The embalmers used a naturally occurring salt called natron, which is a mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, along with some sodium chloride and sodium sulfate. This magical substance could absorb moisture very effectively. The body would be covered completely in natron, inside and out. The body cavity would be packed with natron. More natron would be piled on top and around the body. Then the body would be left like this for 40 days. During this time, the natron would slowly draw out all the moisture from the tissues. The body would shrink, becoming dried and preserved. After 40 days, the natron would be removed. The body would be brittle and dark but perfectly preserved. Next came the wrapping process. But before wrapping began, the body needed to be made more lifelike again. The embalmers would stuff the body cavity with linen, sawdust, or other materials to give it shape. Sometimes they would insert false eyes. Sometimes they would apply makeup to the face. The goal was to make the body look as much like the living person as possible, so the Ka and Ba would recognize it. Then came hundreds and hundreds of yards of linen bandages. The wrapping was done with great care and according to specific rituals. First, each finger and toe would be wrapped individually, then the arms and legs, then the torso, then the whole body would be wrapped again. Between the layers of bandages, the priests would insert amulets, small charms that would protect the deceased in the afterlife. There were many types of amulets. The scarab amulet, shaped like a beetle, would help with rebirth. The D-jade pillar gave stability and strength. The Eye of Horus gave protection. The Tiet, or Isis knot, gave the protection of the goddess Isis. Each amulet had to be placed in the right position on the body while the correct spells were recited. The wrapping process alone could take 15 days. When it was complete, the body would be entirely covered in linen, transformed into what we recognize as a mummy. Sometimes a portrait mask would be placed over the face, showing what the person had looked like in life. For pharaohs and wealthy nobles, this mask might be made of gold and precious stones. For common people, it might be painted wood or linen. Finally, the mummy would be placed in a coffin. Wealthy people might have several nested coffins, each one more elaborate than the last, each decorated with protective spells and images of the gods. The coffin itself was considered a protective shell, a house for the deceased, a sacred space where they could rest safely. But preserving the body was only the first step in preparing for the afterlife. The physical form was secure, but what about the journey ahead? This is where the famous Book of the Dead becomes crucial. The Book of the Dead was not actually a single book with a fixed text. It was a collection of spells, prayers, hymns, instructions, and maps that would help the deceased navigate the dangers of the duat and reach the paradise beyond. Think of it as a guidebook for the afterlife, a manual for the dead, a collection of cheat codes for the most important journey a person would ever take. These texts had a long history. The earliest version was the pyramid texts, which were carved into the walls of pyramids during the Old Kingdom, around 2400 to 2300 BCE. These were meant exclusively for pharaohs, magical spells that would help the divine king transform into a god and join Ra in his solar bark. Later, during the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, these spells were adapted and expanded into the coffin texts, which were painted on the coffins of nobles and wealthy commoners. Now, not just pharaohs, but anyone who could afford it could access these magical spells. By the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, the tradition had evolved further into what we call the Book of the Dead. These spells would be written on papyrus scrolls and placed in the tomb with the deceased. Some tombs had the spells painted directly on the walls. Each collection was customized for the individual. A wealthy person might have a scroll with nearly 200 spells, beautifully illustrated by skilled scribes. A poorer person might only be able to afford a few basic spells written on a small piece of papyrus, or even on strips of linen that would be wrapped with the mummy. What kind of spells were in the Book of the Dead? They covered every possible situation that might arise in the afterlife. There were spells to help you remember your own name, which was crucial because your name was part of your identity and might be forgotten in the confusion of death. There were spells to transform into different animals if needed, becoming a falcon to fly over obstacles, becoming a crocodile to navigate dangerous waters, becoming a lotus flower to be reborn. There were spells to avoid having to do manual labor in the afterlife, which the Egyptians considered a horrible fate even after death. There were spells to protect against demons and hostile gods. There were spells to get past guardians who blocked the way. There were spells to provide you with food and water. There were spells for breathing, for walking, for seeing, for all the basic functions of existence that might not work properly in the strange environment of the afterlife. Each spell had to be spoken correctly, with the right words, at the right time, with the right ritual gestures. It was like having the ultimate survival guide for the most dangerous journey imaginable. If you studied these spells during your life, if you had them written in your tomb, if you could recite them correctly when the time came, your chances of success improved dramatically. After death, the soul would leave the body and begin its journey through the duat. This was the same strange underworld that Ra travelled through each night, the same realm of demons and monsters and impossible geography. The deceased would follow a similar path to Ra's solar bark, encountering many of the same dangers, facing many of the same challenges. The journey was long and terrifying. You would pass through gates guarded by frightening creatures with knives. At each gate, you had to know the secret name of the guardian. If you did not know it, you could not pass, and you might wander forever in the darkness. You would cross rivers of fire that burned without consuming. You would walk through halls filled with serpents and demons who wanted to devour your soul. You would face gods who questioned you, tested you, tried to trick you. At each challenge, you would need to know the right spell from your Book of the Dead, the right prayer, the right magic word to continue. This is why knowing these spells was literally a matter of eternal life and death. Without them, you would be lost, destroyed, consumed by the dangers of the underworld. But if you knew the spells, if you could navigate the dangers, if you were brave and prepared and righteous, you would eventually reach the most important location in the entire duat, the Hall of Two Truths, also called the Hall of Ma'at. This was where judgment would take place. This was where you would discover whether you had lived a good enough life to continue to the paradise beyond, or whether you would be destroyed forever, suffering the true death from which there was no return. Chapter 6. The Weighing of Hearts. The Hall of Two Truths was vast beyond imagination, a chamber that existed outside normal space, a courtroom where the most important trial in the universe took place every day, many times a day, as souls arrived to be judged. Picture walls that stretch up until they fade into shadows that might be ceilings or might be infinite darkness. The floor is polished stone, smooth as glass, reflecting the uncertain light that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. Tall pillars, carved from top to bottom with hieroglyphs, support the ceiling or the sky or whatever exists above. Each hieroglyph is a spell, a prayer, a sacred word, adding to the power and solemnity of this place. At the far end of the hall sits Osiris, the god of the dead, on his throne. Osiris appears as a mummified king, wrapped in white linen but with his green skin showing through. His skin is green like growing things, like the crops that sprout from the earth, because Osiris represents not just death but also resurrection and rebirth. He wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, tall and elongated, symbolizing his royal status. In his crossed arms, he holds the crook and flail, the traditional symbols of kingship and divine authority. The crook is a shepherd's staff, representing the pharaoh as the shepherd of his people. The flail is a threshing tool used in farming, representing the pharaoh as the provider of food and sustenance. Osiris is perfectly still, perfectly patient. He has been sitting here for thousands of years, judging the souls of the dead, and he will sit here for thousands more. Time means nothing to him. He has seen millions of souls approach his throne. He has witnessed millions of judgments. He knows the outcome before the process begins, yet the ritual must still be performed. The weighing must still take place. The truth must still be revealed. Before Osiris, in the center of the great hall, stands a large scale. This is not an ordinary scale for weighing grain or gold. This is the most important scale in the entire universe, the scale that will weigh the truth of a person's life, the scale that will determine whether a soul continues or is destroyed forever. The scale is made of materials that exist only in the divine realm: wood from trees that grew in the garden of the gods, metal that was mined from stars, gems that formed in the heart of creation itself. Standing beside the scale are several gods, each with a specific role to play in the judgment ceremony. Thoth is there, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and truth. Thoth holds a palette and stylus, ready to record the results of the weighing. He is the divine scribe, the keeper of records, the documenter of truth. Everything that happens in this hall is written down by Thoth in his great books, preserved forever in the divine archives. Anubis is there, the jackal-headed god of embalming and protector of graves. Anubis has been with the deceased since the moment of death. He was present during the mummification, watching over the body, ensuring the rituals were performed correctly. He guided the soul through the early parts of its journey through the Duat. And now, in the Hall of Ma'at, Anubis will actually operate the scale. He will place the heart on one side and the feather on the other. He will watch as the scale settles, as the balance is found, as the truth is revealed. And crouching nearby, absolutely still, absolutely silent, absolutely patient, is Amit. She is waiting. She is always waiting. Amit is a monster, a creature of nightmare, a composite of the three most dangerous animals in Egypt. She has the head of a crocodile, with its massive jaws and rows of razor-sharp teeth. She has the front legs and body of a lion, with its muscular strength and killing claws. She has the back legs of a hippopotamus, which, despite looking slow and peaceful, was actually one of the most dangerous animals in Egypt, responsible for many deaths each year. Amit combines all three of these deadly creatures into one terrifying form. Her name means devourer or eater of the dead. She sits there, perfectly still, her crocodile eyes fixed on the scale, waiting to see if she will get to eat. She is patient. She has eaten many hearts over the centuries. She will eat many more. Some days she feeds well, other days she goes hungry. But she never complains. She never leaves. She simply waits, doing her job, playing her role in the cosmic order. When the deceased enters the Hall of Two Truths, they must first face the 42 divine assessors. These are gods who represent different aspects of morality and justice. They sit in judgment, watching, listening, evaluating. Before these 42 gods, the deceased must recite what are called the negative confessions. This is a list of 42 sins that the person must swear they did not commit. It is called the negative confessions because instead of confessing what you did wrong, you are declaring what you did not do wrong. The deceased stands before the assembly of gods and begins to speak. Their voice might shake with fear. They might struggle to remember all 42 declarations, but they must try. This is their moment to prove their righteousness, to demonstrate that they lived according to Ma'at. I have not committed sin, they declare. I have not done violence to anyone. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not told lies. I have not taken food from a child. I have not fornicated. I have not been angry without cause. I have not made anyone cry. I have not polluted water. I have not been arrogant. I have not been greedy. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not gossiped. I have not stirred up strife. I have not made anyone afraid. I have not been hot-tempered. I have not been deaf to words of truth and justice. On and on the list goes, covering every type of wrongdoing that the ancient Egyptians considered important. Notice what they valued. Not just big dramatic crimes like murder and theft, but also seemingly smaller things like making people cry, gossiping, being arrogant, polluting water. The Egyptians cared about how you treated other people on a daily basis. They cared about kindness, about community, about taking care of the environment and resources. Their moral code was sophisticated and detailed, concerned with both major sins and minor transgressions. I have not withheld milk from the mouths of children, the confession continues. I have not driven cattle away from their pasture. I have not snared birds in the marshes of the gods. I have not caught fish with fish bait. I have not held back water in its season. I have not built a dam against running water. I have not extinguished a fire when it should burn. I have not neglected the dates for offering choice meat. I have not driven away cattle from the property of the gods. Even animals and natural resources were protected by Ma'at. You could not mistreat cattle, even if they belonged to someone else. You could not dam up water that others needed. You could not catch more fish than you needed. You could not waste fire. Everything was part of the cosmic balance, and disturbing that balance in any way was a sin. After reciting the 42 negative confessions, the deceased must approach the scale for the actual weighing. This is the moment of ultimate truth. This is when everything is revealed. No more words. No more declarations. Now there is only the scale, the heart, the feather, and the truth. Anubis steps forward. The hall becomes absolutely silent. Even Amit stops moving, her eyes fixed on the scale. Anubis reaches out and takes the deceased person's heart, the Ib, which has been magically transported to this place for judgment. The heart feels heavier than it should, weighed down not just with physical mass, but with the accumulated experiences, choices, and deeds of an entire lifetime. Every kind word ever spoken adds to its weight. Every cruel act makes it heavier. Every lie, every theft, every moment of anger or greed, all of it is recorded in the heart. Anubis places the heart carefully on one side of the scale. the scale dips down under the weight. On the other side of the scale, Anubis places a single feather. This is the feather of Ma'at herself, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. The feather is white, perfect, light as air. It represents ideal truth, perfect balance, absolute righteousness. It is what the heart should be like if the person lived a good life. Then everyone waits. The scale moves, adjusting, settling, seeking its balance point. This can take what feels like forever, though time moves differently in the Hall of Ma'at. The deceased stands there, watching their heart and the feather, hoping, praying, perhaps remembering moments from their life, and wondering if they did enough good, if they were kind enough, if they followed Ma'at closely enough. Osiris watches from his throne, his green face impassive, his eyes ancient and knowing. Thoth stands ready with his stylus, prepared to record the result. Anubis watches the scale with his sharp jackal eyes, ensuring that the weighing is fair and accurate. Amit crouches nearby, her mouth slightly open, ready to spring forward if needed. There are 3 possible outcomes to this weighing, though really only 2 that matter. The best outcome is that the heart is lighter than the feather, or equal to it in weight. If this happens, it means the deceased lived a good life. They followed Ma'at. They were honest, kind, and just. They did not accumulate heavy sins that weighed down their heart. When this happens, Osiris speaks for the first time, his voice like distant thunder, like stone sliding on stone, like the voice of eternity itself. Your heart is light, Osiris declares. You have lived in truth. You have followed Ma'at. You are justified. The word justified is important. In Egyptian, it was Ma-Cheru, which means true of voice. When you are declared justified, it means that everything you said in your negative confessions was true. Your voice spoke truth. You were honest. And now you are welcomed into the afterlife, into the paradise known as the Field of Reeds. Thoth records the positive judgment in his great book. The deceased's name is written in the scrolls of the justified. They will exist forever, remembered, honoured, safe. Osiris gestures, and the doors to the Field of Reeds open. The deceased can see paradise waiting, fields of grain waving in eternal sunshine, trees heavy with fruit, cool water in canals, family members who died before them, waiting to greet them with joy. They can enter. They have passed the test. But what if the heart is heavier than the feather? What if the scale tips the wrong way? If the heart is weighed down with sins, with cruelty, with lies, with evil deeds? Then something terrible happens. Amit springs forward. She moves with impossible speed, faster than thought, faster than prayer. She snatches the heart from the scale and devours it in one gulp. And with the heart destroyed, the person ceases to exist. This is not being sent to a place of punishment. This is not eternal torture in hell. This is something worse. This is complete and utter annihilation. The person is erased. They never existed. They will never exist again. Their name is forgotten. Their memory fades. Their soul dissipates into nothing. This is called the second death, and it is the one thing that every Egyptian truly feared above all else. There is no appeal from this judgment. There is no second chance. There is no mercy or forgiveness. The scale does not lie. The feather represents perfect truth, and truth is absolute. Either you lived well or you did not. Either your heart is light or it is heavy. The universe does not care about your excuses or your intentions. Only your actual deeds matter. Only the truth weighs on the scale. This is why there was a spell in the Book of the Dead, spell 30b, that many Egyptians included in their burials. It was addressed to their own heart, a desperate plea that even if they had done wrong, perhaps their heart might stay silent about it, might not testify against its owner. O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my different ages, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not speak against me in the presence of the great God. Do not create opposition to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. You are my car which is in my body, the one who guards my limbs. Do not testify against me concerning what I have done. Do not tip the balance against me before the great God. It is a heartbreaking spell, really. A last desperate hope that even if you were not perfect, even if you made mistakes, perhaps you could still pass the judgment. But the truly righteous had no need of this spell. Those who genuinely lived according to Ma'at would approach the scale with confidence, knowing they had nothing to hide. Their hearts were light because they had been honest in their dealings. They had been kind to others. They had maintained order rather than creating chaos. They had done their small part to continue the work of creation, to keep none from rushing back in, to maintain the universe. And this is what the judgment scene reveals about Egyptian values. They did not believe in an arbitrary God who might forgive or punish based on whim or mood. They believed in a mechanical, fair, objective measure of truth. Your heart either was light or it was not. You either had lived well or you had not. There was no fooling the scale. There was no bribing the judges. There was no talking your way out of it with clever words or excuses. The feather of Ma'at did not care about your reasons or your circumstances. It simply existed, perfect and true, and you were measured against it. This was cosmic justice in its purest form. Chapter 7, The Architecture of Heaven. Let us turn our attention now to the sky itself, to the way the ancient Egyptians understood the stars and the heavens above them. When you go outside tonight on a clear night and look up at the stars, what do you see? You might see random points of light scattered across the darkness without pattern or meaning. If you know astronomy, you might recognize planets and constellations, understanding that those lights are distant suns and balls of gas. You might think about the vastness of space, about galaxies and black holes and the expansion of the universe. But when an ancient Egyptian looked up at those same stars, they saw something completely different. They saw a living cosmos, a divine realm, a sky filled with meaning and purpose and the presence of the gods. First and foremost, as we have already discussed, they saw the body of Nut, the sky goddess. The black space between the stars was her skin. The stars themselves were ornaments decorating her body, jewels sewn into her dress, or perhaps the pores of her skin through which divine light shone from the realm beyond. Some traditions said the stars were actually the souls of the righteous dead, the justified who had passed through the hall of Ma'at and been granted eternal life. But the stars were not just decoration. Each one had meaning. Groups of stars formed constellations, but not the same constellations that we recognize today. The ancient Egyptians saw different patterns in the sky, patterns that connected to their own mythology and beliefs, patterns that told their own stories. The most important constellation to the ancient Egyptians was what we call Orion. They called it Sa, and they identified it with Osiris, the god of the dead and rebirth. When you looked at those stars shining in the southern sky, you were looking at the celestial form of Osiris himself. He was there in the heavens, watching over Egypt, ready to judge the souls of the dead, present both in the underworld and in the sky simultaneously. Just below Orion, there was a bright star that we call Sirius. The Egyptians called this star Sopdet, and they identified it with the goddess Isis, the wife and sister of Osiris, the great mother goddess, the lady of magic and protection. So the two most important stars in the Egyptian sky represented the divine couple, Osiris and Isis, forever travelling together across the heavens, never separated, eternally united in the sky. But Sirius, Sopdet, was not just important for religious reasons. It was also crucial for practical, agricultural, survival reasons. The ancient Egyptian calendar and the entire agricultural cycle of Egypt were based on this star. Let me explain why this was so important. The Nile River flooded every year, and this flood was the absolute foundation of Egyptian civilization. When the river flooded, it would overflow its banks and cover the fields with water. When the water receded, it left behind rich, black, fertile soil. This soil was so productive that Egypt became the breadbasket of the ancient world, growing enough grain to feed its population and export the surplus. Everything depended on the flood. But the flood did not happen at random times. It happened every year, at approximately the same season, in what we would call July and August. The Egyptians needed to know when the flood was coming so they could prepare. They needed to harvest any crops still in the fields. They needed to move their animals to higher ground. They needed to protect their homes and buildings. They needed to be ready, and the sky told them when the flood was coming. The Egyptians noticed something remarkable. Every year, just before the flood came, Sirius would reappear in the dawn sky after being invisible for several weeks. This was called the heliacal rising of Sirius. For part of the year, Sirius would be up during the day, invisible because the sun's light drowned it out. Then it would seem to disappear entirely. But then, on one special morning, if you watched the eastern horizon just before sunrise, you would see Sirius rise just ahead of the sun, visible for a few minutes before the sun's light made it disappear again. That morning, when Sirius rose ahead of the sun for the first time after its period of invisibility, that was when the Egyptians knew the flood was coming within days. The priests who watched the sky would make this observation and immediately send word to the pharaoh. Announcements would be made throughout the kingdom. The flood is coming. Prepare. This heliacal rising of Sirius became the marker for the Egyptian New Year. Their year began with the appearance of the star, with the promise of the flood, with the renewal of the land. The calendar, religion, agriculture, all were tied together through the observation of this one star. A point of light in the sky was telling them when to organize their entire civilization's activities. The Egyptians also paid close attention to the northern stars, the ones that circle around the north celestial pole and never set below the horizon, at least not from Egypt's latitude. These stars, called circumpolar stars, were visible every single night of the year. While most stars would rise and set, appearing and disappearing with the seasons, these northern stars were constant, eternal, unchanging. The Egyptians called these stars the imperishable ones, or the indestructibles. They never died. They never disappeared. They were eternal. And the Egyptians believed that when a pharaoh died and was successfully mummified and judged, his soul would rise up to join the imperishable ones. He would become a star in the northern sky, circling forever around the pole, watching over Egypt for all eternity, never setting, never dying, truly immortal. This belief influenced how the pyramids were built in fundamental ways. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for the pharaoh Khufu around 2500 BCE, has narrow shafts that lead from the king's chamber up through the pyramid structure to the outside. For a long time, archaeologists thought these might be air shafts, though that made little sense since the pharaoh was dead and did not need air. Some thought they might be symbolic pathways or have something to do with the construction process. Then, researchers realized something fascinating. These shafts pointed directly at specific stars. One shaft pointed at Thuban, which was the pole star at that time. The pole star changes over thousands of years due to the precession of Earth's axis, and in 2500 BCE, Thuban in the constellation Draco was the star closest to the celestial North Pole. Another shaft pointed at the Orion constellation, specifically at the belt stars. These shafts were not for air. They were star shafts, pathways for the pharaoh's soul to travel up from his mummified body through the pyramid to take its place among the eternal stars. They were launching tubes for the soul, escape routes to immortality, carefully calculated astronomical alignments that would help the dead king achieve his divine destiny. The Egyptians divided the night sky into 36 sections called decans. Each decan was a group of stars that would rise above the eastern horizon at a specific time. As the Earth rotated and as the seasons changed, different decans would be visible at different times. The priests learned to tell time at night by watching which decan was currently rising. They did not have clocks as we know them, but they had the sky. They could look at the stars and say with confidence, "It is now the 3rd hour of the night," or "It is nearly dawn." The stars were their clock, their timepiece, their way of organizing the night into measured intervals. But the stars were more than practical tools for agriculture and timekeeping. They were divine beings, gods and goddesses in their own right, or the transformed souls of the righteous dead. Some stars were believed to be the souls of dead pharaohs, as we have discussed. Other stars were gods who had always existed in the heavens. The circumpolar stars, those imperishable ones, were sometimes said to be the unwavering judges who would help weigh hearts in the hall of Ma'at. They were eternal, unchanging, constant, just like true justice should be. Shooting stars, those brief streaks of light across the night sky, were interpreted as messages from the gods. A shooting star might be a god travelling swiftly on urgent business. It might be a soul ascending to heaven. It might be a divine messenger carrying news. The direction it travelled, the time it appeared, how bright it was, all of these factors would be carefully noted and interpreted by priests who specialized in reading celestial omens. Comets were even more significant. A comet, with its bright head and long tail, appearing suddenly and moving across the sky night after night, was definitely an omen. But whether it was a good omen or a bad omen depended on many factors. Where did it appear? What time of year was it? Where was it pointing? What else was happening in the kingdom? The priests would study all these factors carefully before making a pronouncement about what the comet might mean. The Milky Way itself, that cloudy band of light that stretches across the night sky, was understood in different ways depending on which tradition you followed. In some traditions, it was a river, the celestial Nile, the waterway along which Ra's solar bark would travel during its journey across the sky. The sunboat sailed along this river of stars, and that was why the Milky Way seemed to arc across the entire sky from horizon to horizon. In other traditions, the Milky Way was milk, but not just any milk. It was divine milk that flowed from the udders of a celestial cow goddess. Bat was one such goddess, an ancient deity whose name means simply cow or spirit. Hathor was another, one of the most important goddesses in the Egyptian religion, associated with love, beauty, music, motherhood, and joy. Hathor was often depicted as a cow, or as a woman with cow horns and a sun disk between them. The Milky Way was her milk, flowing across the sky, nourishing the entire universe, feeding the stars and the gods and the souls of the dead. Imagine seeing the Milky Way not as billions of distant stars, but as divine milk, cosmic nourishment, the breast of the universe itself providing for all creation. The ancient Egyptians were careful, dedicated observers of celestial events. They tracked the movements of planets, though they did not understand planets as worlds like Earth orbiting the Sun. They thought of them as special stars that moved in unusual ways, gods who wandered across the sky rather than staying in fixed positions like normal stars. Venus was particularly important. It was the brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon. Venus appeared in the morning sky before sunrise for part of the year, then would disappear, then would reappear in the evening sky after sunset. The Egyptians associated Venus with several different deities, depending on whether it appeared in the morning or evening sky. Understanding even in ancient times that the morning star and evening star were the same object. Mars, with its reddish colour reminiscent of blood, was sometimes connected to Horus in his aspect as a warrior god, or to Set as the god of violence and conflict. The red planet was associated with war, with danger, with the untamed forces that existed at the edges of civilization. Jupiter and Saturn were also tracked carefully, though less is known about specifically what the Egyptians believed about these planets. They moved more slowly across the sky, making their journeys through the constellations over months and years rather than weeks. Eclipses were absolutely terrifying events that disrupted the cosmic order in the most dramatic way possible. A solar eclipse, when the sun disappeared in the middle of the day, was interpreted as Apophis temporarily succeeding in swallowing Ra's boat. It was proof that the daily battle between order and chaos could go badly. The sun, the source of all light and life, was being devoured. The sky would darken, birds would stop singing, confused by the sudden night. Animals would behave strangely. People would panic. Priests would rush to perform emergency rituals. They would recite spells louder and faster. They would burn extra incense. They would make additional offerings. They would shout and make loud noises to frighten Apophis away. The entire population might join in, creating a din of sound designed to help Ra escape from the serpent's gullet. And the fact that the sun always reappeared after an eclipse was seen as proof that these rituals worked, that human effort could assist the gods in their cosmic duties, that the spells and prayers really did have power. Lunar eclipses were less frightening but still significant. The moon, associated with the god Khonsu or sometimes with Thoth, was being attacked or covered or swallowed. Different explanations existed for what caused this, but all agreed it was a disruption of the natural order, an event that required attention and ritual response. The moon turning red during a lunar eclipse was especially ominous, blood in the sky, a sign that something was wrong in the divine realm. But the Egyptians also understood that the sky was not chaotic. There were patterns, things repeated in regular cycles. The stars came back to the same positions year after year. The sun rose in the east and set in the west every single day without fail. The moon went through its phases in a predictable rhythm, waxing from new moon to full moon, and then waning back to new again, over and over, month after month, year after year. This regularity was proof of Ma'at, proof that order was being maintained, proof that the gods were doing their jobs and keeping chaos at bay. The predictability of the heavens was reassuring. It meant that the universe was stable, that creation was secure, that the daily battle against Apophis was being won. If the stars suddenly appeared in different positions, if the sun rose in the west, if the moon stopped going through its phases, that would be a sign that Ma'at had failed, that chaos had won, that the end of the universe was at hand. But the stars stayed in their places. The sun kept its schedule. The moon maintained its cycle. The gods were winning the eternal battle. Creation was safe, at least for another day. And that knowledge brought comfort to the Egyptians as they went about their daily lives, as they worked in their fields, as they raised their children, as they built their temples and tombs, as they tried to live according to Ma'at and prepare for the afterlife. The sky was not a distant, abstract thing to the ancient Egyptians. It was immediate, personal, meaningful. It was the body of a goddess who protected them. It was the pathway of the sun god who brought them life. It was the home of their ancestors who had become stars. It was a map that told them when to plant and when to harvest. It was a clock that told them the hours of the night. It was a book that revealed divine messages. It was proof that order could be maintained against chaos. The sky was everything. Chapter 8. Living in Cosmic Time. So what did it mean to be an ordinary Egyptian, living with this deep cosmological understanding woven into every aspect of existence? How did these grand stories about gods and creation and the journey of the sun and the judgment of the dead affect daily life for a farmer working in the fields, a craftsman in his workshop, a mother raising her children, a merchant selling his goods in the market? The answer is that the cosmos was not separate from ordinary existence. The cosmos was not something that only priests and scribes thought about in temples while everyone else ignored it and focused on practical concerns. No, the cosmic order, Ma'at, the presence of the gods, the ongoing battle against chaos, all of this was intimately, inescapably woven into every single aspect of Egyptian life from birth to death and beyond. Let us walk through a day in the life of an ancient Egyptian and see how cosmology shaped their experience. You wake up before dawn because there is work to be done. In ancient Egypt, most people were farmers or worked in some capacity related to agriculture, the foundation of the entire civilization. But before you begin your daily tasks, before you eat breakfast, before you wake your children, you step outside. You stand in the cool pre-dawn air and you look to the eastern horizon. You wait. And then, as you have every morning of your life, as your parents did and their parents before them going back countless generations, you see the first glow of light. The darkness is being pushed back. The stars are fading. The eastern horizon is turning from black to deep blue to lighter blue to pink to orange to gold. The sun is returning. Ra has successfully navigated through the Duat once again. He has fought off Apophis once more. He has been reborn from the body of Nut. The universe will continue for another day. Creation is safe. Order has triumphed over chaos. Ma'at is maintained. This is not a trivial thing. This is not taking the sunrise for granted as simply the automatic start of a new day. This is witnessing a miracle, a victory, a gift from the gods. You might murmur a prayer of thanks as the sun clears the horizon. Hail to you, Ra, beautiful one who renews himself every day. You appear rising from your horizon, shining as sun disk in the sky. Even if you are not a priest who performs the elaborate temple rituals, even if you cannot afford fancy offerings or do not know all the complex hymns, you can still pause and acknowledge the miracle of the dawn. If you are a priest, your morning is filled with ritual. Before the sun rises, you have already bathed in the sacred lake attached to the temple. This is not just washing. This is ritual purification. Priests bathe twice in the morning and twice at night, 4 baths a day, to maintain their purity. The water washes away any spiritual contamination, any connection to the realm of Isfet, chaos and disorder. You emerge from the water clean, pure, ready to serve the gods. You go to the temple and perform the morning ritual called opening the mouth of the god. The temple is dark inside, lit only by flickering oil lamps. The innermost sanctuary where the god's statue resides is sealed behind doors. No one has entered since yesterday evening. The god has been asleep through the night, resting while Ra battled through the Duat. Now it is time to wake the god. You approach the sealed doors and recite the prescribed prayers. You break the clay seals that secured the doors overnight. You open them carefully, reverently. Inside, in the dim light, you can see the golden statue of the god. It might be Amun, with his tall double plumes. It might be Ptah, in his tightly wrapped shroud. It might be Hathor, with her cow horns and sun disk. Whoever the god is, they have been sleeping, and now you must attend to them. You remove the old clothing from yesterday. You wash the statue with pure water. You anoint it with precious oils. You dress it in fresh linen clothing, beautifully made and dyed in sacred colours. You place new jewellery on the statue. You offer the god breakfast, bread, beer, roasted meat, vegetables, fruit. You burn incense so that the sweet smoke rises up, pleasing to the divine senses. You recite the proper hymns and prayers. What are you doing? You are not just going through meaningless motions. You are maintaining the connection between the human and divine realms. You are ensuring that the god is pleased, satisfied, willing to continue their cosmic duties. If the gods are not fed, if they are not honored, if they are neglected, they might withdraw their blessings from Egypt. The Nile might not flood, the crops might fail, enemies might invade, chaos might spread. Your work as a priest is not ceremonial, it is essential to the survival of civilization itself. But most Egyptians were not priests. Most people worked in the fields, growing the food that kept everyone alive. As the sun rises higher, you go to your work. Perhaps you are a farmer and you walk out to your field with your tools. You check the irrigation channels, making sure water from the Nile is reaching your crops. You examine your wheat or barley, looking for signs of disease or pests. You kneel in the rich black soil and thank Geb, the earth god, for the fertility of the land. This is not superstition. This is acknowledging that the ground beneath you is literally the body of a god, that every plant growing from the soil is growing from Geb's flesh. Perhaps you are a craftsman, a potter or carpenter or metal worker. You go to your workshop and begin your day's labor. As you work, shaping clay or carving wood or forging metal, you are imitating Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, who shaped the universe through his divine craftsman skills. Your work is a sacred act, a participation in creation. Making something useful, something beautiful, is not just earning a living. It is participating in the ongoing process of ordering reality, taking raw chaos and transforming it into organized, purposeful forms. As you go about your work during the day, you are always aware of Ma'at. This is not just a goddess or an abstract concept. Ma'at is the way things should be done. It is the proper order of reality. It is honesty in your dealings with others. It is doing good work, putting in real effort even when you are not being watched. It is treating people fairly regardless of their social status. It is not polluting the water that everyone depends on. It is not destroying resources through greed or carelessness. It is speaking truthfully, even when lies might be more profitable. It is being kind even when no one will know about it. Every time you choose to follow Ma'at, every time you do the right thing even when it is difficult or inconvenient, you are participating in the maintenance of creation. You are pushing back against Isfet, chaos, and disorder. You are doing your small part to make sure that none does not come rushing back in to swallow creation. Your choices matter. Your actions have cosmic significance. You are not just trying to be a good person for your own benefit. You are helping to maintain the universe itself. The rhythms of nature are recognized as the rhythms of the gods. When the Nile floods every year, usually starting in July and peaking in August or September, you understand this as divine action. Different traditions explained the flood in different ways. Some said it was the tears of Isis, mourning for her dead husband Osiris. She wept so much that her tears caused the Nile to rise. Other traditions said it was the benevolence of Hapi, a god of the Nile's inundation, a plump figure with pendulous breasts representing abundance and fertility. Hapi would pour out the floodwaters from his cave somewhere in the far south, sending the life-giving waters north to Egypt. Whatever explanation you believed, the essential truth was the same. The flood was divine. The flood was good. The flood was necessary. Without the flood, there would be no fertile soil. Without the fertile soil, there would be no crops. Without the crops, there would be famine and death. The flood saved Egypt every year. It was a gift from the gods that had to be received with gratitude and celebrated with proper rituals. When you planted your seeds in the fertile mud after the waters receded, you were reenacting the moment when the Benben first rose from none, when land emerged from water, when the potential for life became actual life. Planting a seed was a sacred act, participating in creation, trusting in the gods to make the seed grow. When you harvested your crops months later, You thanked Geb for the earth that nurtured the plants, and Osiris for the principle of death and rebirth that allowed dead seeds to transform into living grain. You would offer the first portion of your harvest to the gods, taking it to the temple as an offering, giving back to the divine realm some of what it had given to you. When you got married, you and your spouse stood before family and community, but you also stood before the gods. You thought of Geb and Nut, the earth and sky who loved each other so much they had to be separated, whose love was so powerful it shaped the entire structure of the universe. You hoped that your love would be even a fraction as strong, as eternal, as meaningful. When your children were born, you prayed to Bez and Taweret, protective deities who watched over childbirth and young children. Bez was a dwarf god with a lion's mane and a protruding tongue, deliberately ugly to scare away evil spirits. Taweret was a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, combining human and animal features. These were not grand cosmic deities like Ra or Osiris. They were humble household gods, but no less important for that. They watched over the vulnerable moments of life, protecting mothers and babies during the dangerous time of childbirth. When someone in your family died, you participated in the mourning rituals that had been performed in Egypt for thousands of years. Professional mourners, usually women, would be hired to wail and tear their hair and throw dust on their heads. This was not fake grief. These women were channeling the mourning of Isis and Nephthys when Osiris was killed. They were ritually embodying divine sorrow, helping the deceased's soul transition from life to death, announcing to the gods that another soul was beginning its journey through the Duat. If you could afford it, you would have your loved one mummified. You would purchase a copy of the Book of the Dead to place in the tomb. You would visit the tomb on special days, bringing food and drink to share with your deceased family member, who was believed to be able to come forth from the tomb to participate in these meals. Death was not a complete separation. The living and the dead were all part of the same cosmic community, all children of the gods, all participants in creation. The temples scattered throughout Egypt were not just religious buildings, they were models of the universe itself. When you walked into a temple, you were symbolically moving from the outer world of chaos through increasingly sacred space until you reached the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary at the very center, which represented the moment and place of creation itself. The temple floor was the earth, solid and stable. The ceiling was painted with stars, representing Nut's body arching across the heavens. The columns that supported the ceiling were shaped like papyrus reeds or lotus flowers. The plants that grow at the border between water and land, between the Nile and the shore, between chaos and order. Walking between these columns was like walking through the primordial marsh where creation first began. The walls were covered with hieroglyphs and images, not just as decoration but as actual magic. Every image was a spell, a prayer, a word of power adding to the sacredness of the space. The walls showed the pharaoh making offerings to the gods, maintaining the cosmic order through ritual. They showed the gods in their various forms, making their presence real and accessible. They showed the creation of the world, the journey of the sun, the judgment of the dead, all the great stories that gave meaning to existence. The festivals throughout the year were ways of participating in cosmic events, of renewing the connection between the human and divine realms. The Opet festival, one of the most important celebrations in Egyptian culture, would last for weeks during the season of the Nile flood. The statue of Amun would be carried in a grand procession from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple, travelling by sacred barque boat along the Nile. Thousands of people would line the route, celebrating, singing, feasting. This was not just a parade. The procession represented the journey of the sun god across the sky. It represented the flow of divine energy from the gods to the land. It was a way of renewing the pharaoh's connection to the divine, reinforcing his right to rule, recharging his royal power so he could continue to maintain Ma'at for another year. The said festival was even more significant, though it happened less frequently. A pharaoh would celebrate his said festival after 30 years of rule, and then every 3 years after that. This was a ritual renewal of the king's strength and vitality. The pharaoh would run around a course, demonstrating his physical fitness. He would perform various rituals that proved he was still capable of ruling. In ancient times, there is some evidence that if a pharaoh could not complete these rituals, he might be killed and replaced. By the historical period we know more about, the festival had become purely symbolic, but it still carried enormous importance. The king was being reborn, renewed, empowered to continue his cosmic duty of maintaining order. During the beautiful Feast of the Valley, families would travel to the necropolis, the city of the dead where tombs were located. This was usually on the west bank of the Nile, in the desert, because the west was associated with death and the setting sun. Families would visit the tombs of their ancestors, bringing food and drink. They would have picnics in the cemetery, sharing meals with the dead, who were believed to come forth from their tombs on this special day to join their living families. It was a time of both sadness and joy, remembering those who had passed while celebrating the fact that death was not an ending but a transformation. Even the pharaoh himself, the most powerful person in Egypt, was part of this cosmological system. He was not just a political ruler, making laws and commanding armies. He was the living Horus, the earthly embodiment of the Falcon god. He was the son of Ra, carrying solar divinity within his mortal body. He was the intermediary between the gods and humanity, the one person who could speak to both realms, who could maintain the connection, who could keep the divine favor flowing to Egypt. When the pharaoh performed rituals in the temples, he was not just going through the motions to impress his subjects. He was actually maintaining Ma'at, actually doing the work that kept creation functioning properly. His actions had genuine cosmic significance. If the pharaoh failed to perform the proper rituals, if he ruled unjustly, if he allowed Isfet to spread through his laziness or corruption, then the entire universe might be at risk. Ma'at might falter. The Nile might not flood. Enemies might invade. Chaos might spread. This was an enormous burden for one person to carry. The pharaoh was responsible for the survival not just of his kingdom but of the cosmic order itself. Everything depended on him ruling justly, maintaining rituals, upholding Ma'at. It is no wonder that pharaohs built such elaborate tombs and spent so much effort preparing for the afterlife. They needed to become gods themselves, to join Ra on his solar barque, to continue their cosmic duties even after death. And at night, when your work was done for the day, when you had eaten your evening meal with your family, when you were preparing for sleep, you might go outside one last time. You might look up through a window or step out onto your flat rooftop, and you would see the stars. You would see Nut's body stretched across the heavens, her skin dark as the night, her stars shining like jewels. You would see Sa, the constellation of Orion, knowing it was Osiris watching over you. You would see Sopdet, the star Sirius, knowing it was Isis faithfully accompanying her husband across the sky. You would see the imperishable ones circling the northern pole, the eternal stars that never set, and you would think about the righteous dead who had joined them, including perhaps ancestors of your own family. You would think about Ra, currently sailing through the Duat in his night bark. Right now, at this very moment, he was fighting Apophis. Set was striking with his spear. The other gods were reciting spells. The battle for the survival of the universe was taking place in the underworld beneath your feet, or in a parallel dimension, or in some realm that you could not fully comprehend but knew was real. You might murmur a prayer to help Ra in that fight. It was believed that the prayers of righteous humans could add strength to the god's efforts. Your prayer mattered. Your support helped. Even though you were just one person, just an ordinary Egyptian, your participation in the cosmic drama was meaningful. Then you would go inside, lie down on your sleeping mat or bed, and close your eyes, and as you drifted off to sleep, you would dream. The Egyptians believed that dreams were significant, that dreams were not just random firings of a sleeping brain, but actual experiences, actual journeys into other realms. In dreams, you might receive messages from the gods. In dreams, you might visit the Duat yourself, getting a preview of what awaited after death. In dreams, the boundaries between the worlds became thin and permeable. You could experience things that were impossible in waking life. There were professional dream interpreters who could tell you what your dreams meant, whether they were good omens or bad, whether the gods were trying to warn you of something or guide you towards something. Dream interpretation manuals existed, listing common dreams and their meanings. If you dreamed of your teeth falling out, it meant death was near. If you dreamed of drinking beer, it meant healing was coming. If you dreamed of seeing your face in a mirror, it meant a new wife was in your future. And so you dream. You dream of the universe in all its cosmic glory. You dream of endless water, dark and still and infinite. You dream of a mound rising from that water, the first solid thing in all of existence, the Benben stone glowing with potential. You dream of atoms standing on that mound, complete and perfect and alone, beginning the great work of creation with nothing but his own will and power. You dream of gods being born, of Shu and Tefnut emerging into existence, of Geb and Nut loving each other so much that they have to be forced apart to make room for life. You dream of the cosmic egg cracking open, of the sun bursting forth for the first time, driving away the eternal darkness. You dream of Ra's boat sailing across the sky, bringing light and warmth to a grateful world. You dream of the battle in the Underworld, of Set fighting Apophis, of the serpent coiling around the sunboat, trying to swallow it and end creation. You dream of your own death, of your soul leaving your body, of your journey through the Duat with all its terrors and wonders. You dream of standing in the Hall of Ma'at, watching your heart being placed on the golden scale, seeing the feather of truth on the other side, waiting in terrible suspense to see which way the balance will tip. You dream of the field of reeds, the paradise that awaits the justified, with its golden grain waving in eternal sunshine, its cool water flowing in stone-lined canals, its fruit trees always heavy with ripe fruit. You dream of being reunited with family members who died before you, all of you young and healthy and happy, all of you living in peace forever. You dream of being a star, of rising up to join the imperishable ones in the northern sky, of circling the pole for all eternity, watching over Egypt forever, never setting, never dying, truly immortal. The ancient Egyptians lived in a cosmos that was alive with meaning, purpose, and divine presence. They were not tiny specks of nothing in an uncaring void. They were participants in a grand, ongoing, cosmic drama. Their actions mattered. Their choices had weight. Their lives had significance that extended far beyond their individual existence. This is what Egyptian cosmology offered. Not just explanations for where the sun went at night or why the Nile flooded every year. It offered a place in the universe. It offered purpose. It offered the assurance that if you lived well, if you followed Ma'at, if you did your part to maintain order against chaos, then you would not simply cease to exist when you died. You would continue. You would be judged fairly. And if you passed that judgment, you would enter a paradise where you would live forever, surrounded by those you loved, at peace, in joy. The sun has set on ancient Egypt. The temples are ruins now, open to the sky, their roofs collapsed, their colours faded, their sanctuaries empty. The pyramids still stand, eternal monuments in the desert, but no priests perform rituals there anymore. The knowledge of hieroglyphs was lost for over 1,000 years, from the end of ancient Egyptian civilization until the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799. and finally allowed scholars to rediscover how to read the ancient texts. The gods are no longer worshipped, except by a very few modern practitioners who are attempting to reconstruct ancient religious practices. The cosmic order that the Egyptians worked so hard to maintain has given way to new understandings, new cosmologies, new scientific explanations for how the universe works. We know now that the sun does not ride in a boat but is a star around which the earth orbits. We know that the stars are not the souls of the dead but distant suns, many with their own planets. We know that thunder is not the sound of Set fighting Apophis, but the sound of air expanding rapidly as lightning heats it. But the stories remain. We can still read the pyramid texts carved into ancient burial chambers. We can still study the Book of the Dead, painted on papyrus scrolls. We can still stand before the great stone statues of the gods in museums and sense something of what the ancient Egyptians felt when they approached these images. We can still look up at the same stars they watched, the same moon they used to mark time, the same sun that gives us life. The Egyptian understanding of the cosmos was based on observation and imagination. They watched the sun rise and set. They watched the stars circle the sky. They watched the Nile flood and recede. They watched life emerge from the border between water and land. And from these observations, they built a beautiful, coherent, deeply meaningful system of understanding. They created stories that explained not just the physical mechanics of the universe, but the moral and spiritual significance of existence. Their cosmology was not scientifically accurate by modern standards. They did not understand gravity or nuclear fusion or the electromagnetic spectrum. They did not know about galaxies or atoms or DNA, but they understood something profound that we sometimes forget in our modern world with all our scientific knowledge. They understood that the universe is a gift, that existence is not automatic or guaranteed, that order must be constantly maintained against chaos, that our actions have consequences that ripple out beyond our individual lives. They understood that every sunrise is a miracle worth celebrating, that the beating of your heart is a sacred thing, that truth matters more than lies, that kindness matters more than cruelty, that living in harmony with the natural world and with each other is not just practical but cosmically important. These are lessons that transcend the specific details of their beliefs about gods and boats and scales and feathers. As you drift deeper into sleep now, floating in these stories, let yourself rest in that ancient wisdom. The Egyptians were not primitive or superstitious. They were intelligent, observant people trying to understand the great mysteries of existence with the tools and knowledge available to them. They created a system of beliefs that brought comfort, meaning, and purpose to millions of people across thousands of years. And perhaps there is still wisdom in their stories that we can learn from today. Perhaps we need to remember that the world is precious, that life is sacred, that every day is a gift that must be fought for and protected. Perhaps we need to remember that our choices matter, that living with integrity and kindness is not just about being a good person, but about maintaining the fabric of civilization itself. Let yourself float now in those primordial waters of none, feeling the darkness, the stillness, the infinite potential for everything and nothing. Feel the first stirring of consciousness emerging from that vast emptiness, the first thought, the first moment of self-awareness that began the universe. Feel the solid ground of the Benben rising beneath you, giving you a place to stand, a foundation upon which to build. Feel the first rays of the sun warming your face as Ra bursts forth from the cosmic egg, or is born from the body of Nut at dawn. Feel the light driving away the darkness, bringing warmth and life and possibility. Know that you are part of this ongoing story of creation. The ancient Egyptians are gone, but their understanding lives on in these stories. And you, listening to these words right now, you are the latest link in a chain that stretches back thousands of years. You are connected to those ancient people who stood on the banks of the Nile and looked up at the stars and asked the biggest questions that humans can ask. Where did we come from? What happens when we die? Why are we here? What does it all mean? And the Egyptians offered answers, beautiful, complex, deeply human answers, rooted in their observations of the natural world and their profound understanding of the human need for meaning. They imagined gods who were not distant and uncaring, but intimately involved in every aspect of existence. They imagined an afterlife where justice prevailed, where good was rewarded and evil was punished, where nothing was hidden and truth always came to light. They imagined a universe that made sense, that had structure and purpose and meaning woven into its very fabric. Rest now in that knowledge. You are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. The same atoms that formed the limestone blocks of the pyramids are in your body right now. The same photons that illuminated the hieroglyphs painted on temple walls 4,000 years ago are the same kind of light by which you see today. The same cosmic dust that the Egyptians called the body of Nut is the material that formed our Earth and everything on it, including you. We are all made of star stuff, as the astronomer Carl Sagan famously said. We are all fragments of the original creation, pieces of the universe that have become conscious and aware, able to contemplate our own existence. The Egyptians understood this in their own way. We are all children of Nun and Atum and Ra and Geb and Nut. We all carry within us a spark of the divine creative force that spoke reality into existence at the beginning of time. Sleep well, dream traveler. Know that you are held in the ancient wisdom of Egypt, cradled in stories that have brought comfort and meaning to countless souls across millennia. Dream of the eternal waters, of gods and goddesses, of the sun's journey, of the scales of justice, of the paradise that awaits the righteous. Dream of a universe alive with meaning, where every action matters, where truth is sacred, where love transcends even death. And when you wake in the morning, when you are reborn with the dawn just as Ra is reborn every day, remember the lesson of Ma'at. Live truthfully, act justly, maintain order in whatever small corner of the world you inhabit. Be kind, do your part to push back the chaos. Make your life a living prayer, a testament to the gift of existence, a hymn of praise to the miracle of consciousness and being. The universe dreams through us. We are the cosmos becoming aware of itself, looking back at its own origins, contemplating its own nature. We are the latest chapter in a story that began with the first god standing on a mound of earth, surrounded by endless water, deciding to create something rather than nothing. That decision echoes through every heartbeat, every breath, every thought we have. We are the answer to the question that the universe asked itself in that first moment of consciousness. What can be? What should be? What will be? And the answer is you. The answer is life. The answer is consciousness and choice and meaning and connection and love. The ancient Egyptians understood this. They built their entire civilization around it. They devoted their lives to maintaining cosmic order. They faced death without fear because they believed in justice and truth and the eternal nature of the divine spark within each person. Let their wisdom lull you now into the deepest rest. Let the image of Nut arching protectively over you bring peace. Let the thought of Ra sailing victoriously through the night bring reassurance. Let the promise of the scales balancing fairly in the hall of Ma'at bring determination to live well. Let the eternal waters of Nun rock you gently like a child in a mother's arms, safe and protected and infinitely loved. You are not separate from the universe. You are the universe experiencing itself, knowing itself, celebrating itself. You contain within your single mortal body the same creative force that spoke reality into existence. You are a miracle. You are a prayer. You are a living testament to the victory of order over chaos, of light over darkness, of being over nothingness. Rest now. Float in the cosmic waters. Let the ancient Egyptian dreams of the universe become your dreams tonight. Let their stories weave through your sleeping mind, connecting you to the great chain of human meaning-making that stretches from the dawn of consciousness to this present moment and beyond into the future. The chain continues. The story goes on. The sun will rise tomorrow, as it has risen every day since that first dawn when Ra burst from the cosmic egg. Sweet dreams, traveller through time and consciousness. Safe journey through your personal duat, your own underworld of sleep and dreams. May your heart be lighter than a feather. May you wake refreshed, reborn, renewed, ready to live another day in this beautiful, mysterious, meaningful cosmos that we are so privileged to inhabit. The ancient Egyptians understood something profound that echoes across the millennia to reach you right now. Life is a gift. Consciousness is sacred, and every moment we spend in this universe is a treasure beyond measure. Sleep well, and carry that wisdom with you into your dreams and beyond into tomorrow. The stories of Egypt continue through you. The gods smile upon you. The cosmos holds you. Rest now. Rest deeply. The eternal waters cradle you. The stars watch over you. The sun will rise again, and so will you.